Hi everybody, welcome to this video on the topic ethical decision making. In this video, what we will go through and explore is the basic ethical decision models, which basically explains how we make ethical decisions and what are some of the influences on this ethical decision model, including individual factors and situational factors. These ethical decision models can then be used to apply into real life where we will need to make decisions concerning ethical dilemmas and try and understand the impact of our decision. Let's first explore what is an ethical decision. An ethical decision will often require us to make a choice between two or more alternative actions. And these actions, depending on how we choose the alternatives, will have somewhat of a significant effect on others, other people, or our community. And these effects have got a moral or ethical element in it. So let me give you an example of the Ford Pinto case, which happened many years ago, I think in the 70s and the 80s. And in that case, what happened was that Ford had produced these models of Ford cars called the Ford Pinto. And because of pressures to reduce the cost of manufacturing these cars, there were defects in the fuel system, in the fuel container. And as a result of this defect, there is a high risk that when there is a rear collision, there would be an explosion in the car. Now, when the Ford executives found out these defects, they had to make a choice. They had to make a choice of whether to recall all these cars and fix the defect, or to just let the car, be in the market. So there is an alternative course of action that the Ford executives had to take. And these action, the result or the outcome of this action would have a significant effect. In this case, will have an effect on the lives of its customers. And this is an ethical and moral issue. So this would be an example of an ethical decision that many of us, either in our personal or in our work life, will have to make. So what we want to look at is what would be a model for us to make this ethical decision? What would be the steps that we take in order to make such an ethical decision? Now, there are two approaches in developing such a model. The first approach is what we call the rationalist approach. The rationalist approach will require us to reason out, think out a proper process or steps in order to make that decision. Alternate to the rational approach is what we call an intuitionist approach or a sentimentalist approach. This approach will have us adopt a more emotional approach in developing a process of thinking ethically. So we will use perhaps some gut feeling in order to decide what is right or wrong. So we will not look at an emotional approach. We will try to look at it from a rationalist approach by thinking through the steps and deciding what would be the logical step of how we make an ethical decision. So one example of an ethical decision process or an ethical decision model would start out with perhaps identifying or recognizing whether that action or that issue is a moral issue or not. So we need to start off with that perhaps. And then we also need to then make a moral judgment what would be the right thing to do, what would not be a right thing to do. And in thinking about evaluating whether or what is the right thing, then perhaps we may need to use some of the normative ethical theories out there. The normative ethical theories of whether we want to look at it from a consequentialist approach or a non-consequentialist approach, or we want to adopt a pluralistic view taking into account both consequentialist and non-consequentialist approach. And once we are able to decide whether what is the right thing to do, then the next thing that we probably need in that process is to establish or determine whether we want to do something about it, whether we want to take action and do the right thing or not. So that intent perhaps is the next step in that process. And finally is whether we want to act on that intent, whether we really want to do the right thing or not. So this may be a 4-step process that may, in a very simple approach, explain maybe how, in general, we would think through the process when we are thinking about an ethical issue. Now, these steps, these processes don't exist in a vacuum. There are going to be influences on this process. And the influences will come from within the person that is making the decision. We call it individual influence. That means to say the person making the decision, what is the value of that person? What is the moral development of that person? How aware is that person of what is right and what is wrong? So that would influence the decision that they make. That will influence the way they make the decision. Now, that person does not just exist in a vacuum. They don't exist alone. Each one of us exists in an environment, in a community, right? So another factor or another group of factors that may influence the decision process would be what we call situational factors. Our environment, our workplace, the culture that we are in could also influence the way we decide things. The issue itself, how significant is the issue, how big is the issue, and how close to us is the issue, could also affect our decision-making process. So our decision-making process will therefore have an individual influence as well as a situational influence. So that would be a summary of a simplified model of how we may make that decision, that ethical decision. Now we have to bear in mind that there are limitations to this ethical decision. It's a very simplified model. In real life, we may not think in that linear manner, step by step, step 1 followed by step 2, followed by step 3. In real life, we could be doing all these simultaneously in our mind. We could even start from whether we can do something, and if we feel that we can't, we may not even be looking at it and asking the question whether it's a moral issue or not. So we need to bear in mind that when we apply this ethical decision model, we must be mindful that we may not apply it in a linear manner, and it is just a simplified understanding of the model so that we have some way of understanding the process itself. So in summary, what we have looked at now is we have an understanding of what is an ethical decision. An ethical decision would be a decision where we have to choose between 2 or more alternatives, and there is an impact, a moral or ethical impact on other people around us. And we have looked at a very basic ethical decision model and the influences on these ethical decision process that we have discussed. So I hope you found it useful, and thank you for listening. Bye for now.